He pulled a dying woman from a burning wreck, and in doing so, made himself the most dangerous man in America. She wasn't just a billionaire. She was a secret someone powerful enough to start a war was desperate to bury. And the man hunting her? Logan Veyron had once called him family. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, drop a like, and comment the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now buckle up, because this one doesn't slow down. The fog came in thick that morning, the kind that swallowed the Oregon coast whole and left you feeling like the rest of the world had simply stopped existing. Logan Veyron had learned to appreciate that feeling. He ran the cliff trail every morning before dawn, not because he particularly enjoyed running, but because it was the only hour of the day that belonged entirely to him. By 6:30, his daughter Emma would be awake and demanding pancakes. By 7, the chaos of being a single father would resume with full force. But out here, in the gray silence before sunrise, with nothing but the sound of waves breaking 300 feet below and the soft rhythm of his own breathing, he could almost pretend he was just a man living a quiet life. Almost. Ranger ran slightly ahead, the way he always did. The Belgian Malinois moved through the fog like he owned it, nose working constantly, ears rotating like radar dishes. 8 years old and still operating like a machine. Logan had served 2 combat tours with that dog. He'd carried Ranger out of a firefight in Kandahar on his back when the dog took a fragment to the shoulder. Ranger had sat beside Logan's hospital bed for 3 days straight after Logan caught a round outside of Mosul. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, family, which was why Logan trusted Ranger's instincts more than his own. He almost missed it. The dog stopped so suddenly that Logan nearly tripped over him, catching himself with one hand braced against the guardrail post at the trail's edge. He looked down at Ranger, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Ranger wasn't playing. Ranger wasn't distracted by a rabbit or a scent trail. The dog was locked, every muscle rigid, nose pointed down toward the cliffs, a low sound building in his chest that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine. It was the sound Ranger made when something was wrong. Logan followed the dog's gaze. The fog was thick enough that he almost didn't see it, but there, maybe 40 feet down the cliff face, wedged between 2 massive rock formations where the land broke apart and dropped into the water, something was burning, not a campfire, not a flare, a vehicle. What had clearly been a large SUV, armored by the look of the reinforced frame still visible through the flames, crumpled against the rocks like a discarded tin can. Hell! Logan didn't think. He was moving before the word had fully left his mouth, stripping off his outer layer as he went, scanning the cliff edge for the fastest route down. There was no path. There never was, out here. This stretch of coast was deliberately undeveloped. No beach access, no trails, nothing but vertical rock and open water. The kind of place you didn't end up unless you'd driven off the road, or been run off it. The descent was ugly. He went down hand over hand using the natural ledges in the rock face, knees scraping granite, boots searching for purchase that wasn't always there. Ranger watched from the top, pacing, making the sound again. Logan hit a ledge about 15 feet up from the rocks, assessed the drop, and took it, landing hard, rolling with it, coming up with blood on his palm and grit in his teeth. The heat from the vehicle hit him immediately. The back half was fully engulfed. The engine compartment was still intact but smoking hard, the kind of smoke that turned thick and chemical when fuel lines started to go. He had maybe 2 minutes before the whole thing became a problem he couldn't walk away from. Logan circled the wreck fast, looking for anything alive inside. The passenger side was crushed against the rock. No access. The driver's window had blown out in the impact. He pressed through the smoke and looked inside. The driver was gone. Or what was left of the driver wasn't something that was going to survive. But the rear passenger door, the one facing away from the rock, was bent outward at an angle, jammed but not destroyed. He grabbed the handle with both hands, braced his foot against the frame, and pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, harder this time, putting his legs into it, and the door groaned and buckled and gave maybe 2 inches before stopping against the warped frame. 2 inches wasn't enough. Logan looked around, found a section of the vehicle's undercarriage that had broken loose in the impact, a length of steel bar about 18 inches long. He shoved it into the gap and leaned on it like a lever. The door shrieked and tore and came open. She was inside. A woman, mid-30s maybe, dark hair plastered across her face with blood. A deep gash ran along her hairline, and her left arm was at an angle that told him the radius or ulna had gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to. She was breathing, shallow, fast, the way people breathed when their body was fighting to stay running, but the tank was draining. Seatbelt still on. Logan cut it with the knife he kept clipped to his running shorts. Old habit, never run without a blade. His ex-wife had thought that was insane, and maybe she hadn't been entirely wrong, and got his arms under the woman's torso. She made a sound, more of a gasp, really. Her eyes cracked open, dark and unfocused, swimming. "Don't move your neck," Logan said. "I don't know what's broken, and I don't have time to find out. I need you to try to stay still and let me do the work." She didn't respond, but she didn't fight him either, which was something. He pulled her clear in a controlled slide, keeping her spine as straight as he could manage with one arm broken and his own hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline he was refusing to let slow him down. He got her 10 feet from the vehicle, 15, 20, and then the explosion hit. Not a massive fireball, more of a hard, percussive whump that pushed Logan forward 2 steps and sent a wave of heat across the back of his neck. He turned and watched the vehicle finish itself off against the rocks. And he thought about how 30 seconds earlier he'd been standing inside that. He looked down at the woman in his arms. She was looking back at him. "You're okay," he said, which wasn't entirely true but wasn't entirely false either. "I've got you. You're out." Her mouth moved. He leaned closer. Her voice was barely there. A thread of sound, hoarse, scraped raw. "Don't tell anyone you found me." Logan pulled back slightly and looked at her face. Her eyes were sharper now than they had any right to be for someone who'd just been through a vehicle fire. There was fear in them, but underneath the fear was something else. Something calculated. Even in that moment, half conscious and bleeding from her head, she was thinking. "What?" he said. "Don't tell anyone." She swallowed, winced. "Whoever did this, they'll come back. To finish it." Logan stared at her for a moment. Then he looked up at the cliff above him, at Ranger still pacing at the edge, at the empty gray sky and the road above that he could barely see through the fog. The rational part of his brain, the part that had been trying very hard to live a normal life for the past 4 years, said, "Call 911, wait for the paramedics, answer the questions, be done with this." The other part of his brain, the part that had survived Kandahar and Mosul, and 17 other situations he wasn't allowed to talk about, looked at the deliberate way this vehicle had gone over the cliff, looked at the missing driver, looked at the woman's eyes, and said something different. She's not wrong. Getting back up the cliff with an injured woman was significantly harder than coming down alone. Logan improvised a harness using his running jacket tied around her torso, went up first to signal Ranger to back away from the edge, then descended again to get her. It took 40 minutes. By the end of it, he had a torn shoulder, she had passed out twice from the pain of her broken arm, and both of them were scraped and dirty enough that they looked like they'd crawled out of the earth itself. Ranger met them at the top. The dog went directly to the woman, pressed his nose gently against her cheek, and looked at Logan with an expression that somehow managed to convey both, "I found them, and what are we going to do now?" simultaneously. "I don't know yet," Logan told him honestly. His truck was parked at the trailhead. He got her into the back seat with her arm as stabilized as he could make it using strips from his running shirt. She drifted in and out the whole drive back to the house. Not fully unconscious, not fully present. Occasionally she made a small, involuntary sound when the truck hit a rough patch of road. And each time she did, Ranger, riding shotgun because the situation had clearly passed the point where Logan was going to tell him no, turned and checked on her. His daughter's bike was still on the porch when he pulled up. Emma would be at school for another 6 hours. That was something, at least. Logan carried the woman inside and got her onto the couch in the living room, the one Emma had picked out herself. Blue corduroy, too wide for the space, and went to work. He'd done battlefield medicine in conditions considerably worse than this. The arm needed a real set, and he wasn't going to try that without a hospital and proper imaging. What he could do was clean the head wound, which was deep but not skull-threatening, get her temperature up because she was shaking badly by now, and assess what else might be going on underneath the blood and the mud and the shock. He was wrapping the head wound when she came back to herself properly. Not gradually, the way most people woke up when they'd been through something like this. She was suddenly present, eyes open, alert, scanning the room fast, taking in the house, the dog, Logan, the windows, the door. In that order. He noticed the order. "You're in a private home," he said, without her having to ask. "You're off-road about 9 miles from where I found you. No one knows you're here." She didn't relax, not exactly, but something in her shoulders shifted slightly. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was stronger now, still rough, but controlled. "Logan Veyron. I live here." He tied off the bandage. "You want to tell me your name? Or are we going to skip that part?" A beat of silence. Amelia Voss. The name hit him differently than he expected, because he knew that name. Everyone who'd spent any time adjacent to the defense industry knew that name. Amelia Voss, CEO of Voss Defense Systems, one of the largest private defense technology contractors in the country. The woman whose company held contracts that touched everything from drone guidance systems to tactical communications infrastructure. He kept his face neutral. "The CEO." "Yes." "Someone drove you off a cliff." "They ran me off a cliff," she corrected, and there was something almost sharp in it, even now. "The driver's side was hit first, twice, by a vehicle without plates that forced me toward the guardrail. Victor, my driver." She stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. "Victor didn't make it." Logan was quiet for a moment. "I know. I'm sorry." She nodded, once. The way people nodded when they weren't anywhere close to actually processing something but couldn't stop moving forward. "How bad is my arm?" she said. "Broken. You need a hospital." "I can't go to a hospital." "Ms. Voss." "Amelia." "Amelia." He sat back in the chair he'd pulled next to the couch. "You have a fracture, probably a concussion, and you've lost enough blood that you look like chalk. I don't have the equipment here to—" "I know." Her eyes met his. "I know what I need. And I know what going to a hospital means. The moment my name goes into a system, they'll know I'm alive. And I have maybe 48 hours before I'm scheduled to testify before a federal oversight committee. 48 hours in which the people who did this will be looking for me." Logan studied her, the cut on her forehead, the shadows under her eyes. The way she held herself, upright, controlled, every bit of this costing her something, and none of it showing on her face except in the very slight tightening around her jaw. "Who are they?" he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. "People who've been hiding something for a very long time," she said. "And I have the proof." She told him the broad strokes over the next hour, stopping occasionally when the pain spiked and she needed a minute. Logan didn't push. He made coffee, real coffee, not the single-serve pod stuff, because Emma had somehow acquired strong opinions about coffee at age 7, and Logan had learned not to fight it, and put a cup in her good hand and let her find her own pace. The story was worse than he'd expected. 3 years ago, Amelia had discovered an anomaly in Voss Defense's accounting records. Not a small one. A series of shell contracts, routed through subsidiaries and dummy vendors, siphoning money to off-book operations she couldn't account for. The numbers ran into the billions, and when she started pulling threads, she found they didn't lead to accounting errors. They led to people. Specifically, they led to a network of individuals inside the defense contracting world, private executives, mid-level government officials, and military personnel, who had spent years manipulating procurement contracts, funneling money to foreign adjacent interests, and covering their tracks with the kind of meticulous care that suggested they'd had help from people who knew exactly how investigations worked. "One of my senior analysts helped me start mapping it," Amelia said. Her voice had gone quieter. "Daniel Reeves. He was the one who first noticed the pattern. He was careful, methodical. He kept everything off the company network, printed hard copies, brought them to me in person." "What happened to him?" Logan asked, though he already had a feeling. "Ruled a suicide," Amelia said flatly. 3 weeks after he gave me the last of the documentation, found in his apartment. She looked down at the coffee cup. Daniel was the most organized person I've ever known. He had a 5-year plan. He had a retirement savings spreadsheet. She paused. He didn't kill himself. Logan said nothing. What was there to say? I kept the drive, she continued. Everything he'd compiled, everything I'd added to it, encrypted, backed up, kept on my person at all times. I was supposed to hand it to the federal committee the morning after my arrival in Portland. She looked up at him. I never made it to Portland. The sabotage, Logan said. They knew your route. Someone leaked it. Someone close enough to know my travel schedule. Something moved across her face, a flash of something old and tired underneath the controlled exterior. I have trusted very few people in my life, Mr. Veyron, and apparently even that number was too many. Logan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He looked at Ranger, who had settled at the end of the couch near Amelia's feet, with the particular kind of solid watchfulness the dog reserved for things that mattered. The people running this operation, Logan said, you said they're trained. What does that mean to you? Amelia looked at him steadily. It means the way my security detail was eliminated wasn't the work of hired muscle. It was coordinated, clean. The first vehicle that hit us didn't ram us. It timed the impact to maximize the spin-out. Whoever planned that understood vehicle dynamics and protective driving. They planned for Victor's countermoves before Victor made them. She held his gaze. I think you know what that means, she said. The same way I think you know who you are, and I think you understand why I'm still talking to you instead of demanding you drive me to the nearest hospital. Logan was quiet for a long moment. I retired, he said, 4 years ago. I know. She said it simply. Not a challenge, not a power move, just a fact she had, the same way she probably had a lot of facts. You have a daughter. You run this trail every morning. You haven't taken a contract since you left the teams. Then you also know why I'm going to tell you that whatever this is, it's not something I'm in a position to... I know the man running the operation, Amelia said quietly. Something in her voice stopped him. His name is Colonel Adrian Mercer. The room didn't change. The coffee was still warm. Ranger was still at her feet. The fog was still pressing against the windows. None of it changed, but something inside Logan's chest went very cold, very still. Colonel Adrian Mercer, his former commanding officer, the man who had trained him, sponsored him, vouched for him when the evaluators had questions, pulled him from a situation in Syria that should have ended differently by calling in favors Logan still didn't fully understand. The man who had handed Logan his discharge papers with a handshake and told him, "You're the best I ever trained, and I mean that." Logan looked at Amelia Voss. "You're certain," he said. Not a question. "His name is in the documentation," she said. "His signature is on 3 of the off-book contracts. He's been running the financial side of this operation for 6 years. Logan stood up, walked to the window, looked out at his yard. Emma's swing set, the flower bed she'd insisted on planting last spring that had produced exactly 2 actual flowers, and a great many optimistic weeds, Ranger's water dish by the back step. 6 years. 6 years, and the man Logan had considered the closest thing to a mentor he'd ever had been. He stopped that thought before it finished itself. "They'll come here," he said. Not to her, more to himself or to the window. "Eventually," Amelia said behind him, "if I'm alive and they don't know where I am, they'll look at every connection point, anyone who might help me. It's what I would do." Logan turned around. She looked back at him from the couch, broken arm, blood on her temple, the remnants of a suit that probably cost more than his truck, and eyes that were steady and clear and not asking him for anything he wasn't willing to give, which, somehow, made it harder. "The drive," he said. "Where is it?" She reached up slowly with her good hand and pressed 2 fingers to the collar of her shirt, just above her collarbone. "Sewn into the lining," she said. "I did it the night before I left. Old habit." Logan looked at her for a long moment. Then he went to the kitchen, called Emma's school to tell them his daughter would be going home with her friend Caitlin today, checked the locks on both doors, and came back into the living room. "I need to look at that arm properly," he said. "Then we need to talk about what comes next." Amelia Voss nodded. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift. The arm was worse than it looked. Logan had set bones before, not in a clinical sense, not with imaging or proper anesthesia, but in the field, in conditions where the alternative was watching someone lose function permanently. He knew what a clean fracture felt like under his hands, and he knew what a complicated one felt like. Amelia's radius had a secondary fracture point he hadn't caught on the initial assessment, which meant the standard 2-point stabilization wasn't going to be enough. She needed surgery, not next week, not in a few days. She needed it now. "I know," she said when he told her. She was sitting very straight on the couch, which he'd come to understand was just how she held herself under pressure. Not rigidity, exactly, more like a deliberate refusal to let the body telegraph what the mind was working through. "And I'm telling you that going to a hospital right now is more dangerous than the fracture. You could lose function in that hand. I understand the risk." "Do you?" He wasn't being cruel about it. He was being direct, which was different. "I'm not talking about inconvenience. I'm talking about nerve compression, permanent—" "Logan." She said his first name like she'd been using it for years, which was slightly disorienting. "I have held this company together through a hostile acquisition attempt, 2 congressional investigations, and a data breach that my own board tried to use as an excuse to push me out. I understand what risk means." A pause. "Said it as well as you can. Get me to the testimony. After that, I will have the best orthopedic surgeon in the country fix whatever needs fixing." He looked at her for a moment, then he went and got what he needed. She made one sound when he reset the bone, a short, controlled exhale through her teeth, like someone who had practiced not making sounds when things hurt, and then she was quiet while he splinted and wrapped the arm properly. Her face had gone the color of old concrete, but she didn't cry, and she didn't pull away, and she didn't pass out, and Logan found himself revising his initial read of Amelia Voss upward in a way that didn't happen often. "Tell me about Mercer," he said while he worked, partly because he needed the information, partly because giving her something to focus on other than her arm seemed like the decent thing to do. She breathed carefully for a moment. "How much do you know about his career after your discharge?" "What's public?" "He made colonel, moved into a coordination role with the Joint Procurement Office, retired about 2 years ago." Logan secured the last wrap and sat back. "Started a private consulting firm, defense sector." "Mercer Strategic Group," Amelia confirmed, which is the legitimate face of the operation. On paper, it's a mid-sized defense consultancy with solid government relationships and a respectable contract portfolio. She shifted slightly, testing the weight of the splinted arm against the pillow Logan had propped under it. "What's not on paper is the secondary structure that runs underneath it. A network of shell companies, most of them incorporated in states with minimal disclosure requirements, all of them holding pieces of contracts that were awarded through procurement processes Mercer helped design while he was still in his coordination role." Logan was quiet, processing. He built the system while he was still inside. And then he retired into it. Her voice carried something that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite contempt, more like the professional acknowledgement of a well-executed plan, stripped of any emotional response to what the plan actually was. He spent 6 years in that coordination role shaping how defense procurement decisions got made. Which vendors made the shortlist, which evaluation criteria got weighted, which contract structures got approved. By the time he retired, he had relationships on both sides of every major contract in his portfolio. The people awarding the contracts and the people receiving them. And Voss Defense was in that portfolio. Several contracts, yes. She looked at him directly. "I want to be clear about something. My company was a victim of this, not a participant. The contracts we held were legitimate. Mercer's network was skimming from the administrative layers above our work, padding overhead costs, billing for oversight functions that didn't exist, routing the difference through intermediary vendors that existed only on paper." "How did your analyst find it?" Something shifted in her expression. "Not much, just enough." Daniel was running a reconciliation audit on a contract that had come up for renewal. Routine work. But he noticed that one of the oversight vendors attached to the contract had billed for site visits during a period when our facility had been under a security restriction. No external visitors, no exceptions, documented and signed off all the way up the chain. The visits physically couldn't have happened, but the invoices were paid. Logan stood, walked to the kitchen, came back with a glass of water, and set it within reach of her good hand. He pulled the thread. He pulled it for 3 months before he told me. By then he had documentation on 11 separate contracts across 4 different program offices. The shell structure, the billing patterns, the bank routing. She took a small drink of water. He was careful. He kept everything off network, paid for his own encrypted cloud storage out of pocket, never discussed it on company communications. He was scared, I think, even before he fully understood what he was looking at. Some part of him knew. But he came to you anyway. He came to me anyway. She set the glass down. That's the kind of person Daniel was. He thought it mattered. He thought doing the right thing was more important than... She stopped, looked at a spot somewhere past Logan's shoulder for a moment. Then she came back. He was 31 years old. Logan didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say about Daniel Reeves that wasn't going to sound hollow, and hollow wasn't something Amelia Voss needed from him right now. After he died, she continued, I went to the Federal Oversight Committee directly. Privately, through a contact I trust absolutely. That was 4 months ago. The testimony was scheduled as a sealed proceeding. My name, my travel plans, the date and location, all of it kept inside a circle of 6 people. She paused. Someone in that circle talked. Or someone with access to that circle's communications. She looked at him. Yes, that's possible too. Logan absorbed that. Someone who could surveil a sealed federal proceeding, which meant resources, connections, and the kind of access that didn't come from money alone. Mercer has intelligence contacts, Logan said. It wasn't a question. Several, according to Daniel's documentation. People who transitioned from military intelligence or federal law enforcement into the private sector and maintained their old relationships. She watched his face. You're thinking about how far it goes. I'm thinking about who I can call. He sat down across from her. Ranger had moved during the splinting process and was now pressed against Amelia's legs, not in the frantic way he was when he was alerting, but in the slow, deliberate way he positioned himself when he'd decided something was worth protecting. Logan looked at the dog for a moment, then back at her. There are people I trust, former teammates, intelligence contacts from my time in the teams. Can any of them help us without creating a record that Mercer's people might access? That was the right question, and the fact that she'd asked it immediately told him she'd been thinking along the same lines since she'd woken up on his couch. 1, he said. Maybe. His name is Ray Dalton. He left the NSA about 18 months ago, went fully private. No contracts, no clearances, no affiliations. He does freelance security consulting, and he keeps his footprint small. You trust him. He pulled me out of a bad situation in Yemen that I'm not going to detail, and he's never once mentioned it to anyone, including me. So yes, I trust him. She considered for a moment. Make the call. Logan went to the back bedroom to make it, not because he was hiding the conversation, but because his secure phone was in the drawer of his nightstand under a copy of a Dr. Seuss book that Emma had left there sometime last winter, and that he kept meaning to return to her bookshelf and somehow never did. He looked at the book for a second before he opened the drawer. The Lorax. Emma's current favorite. She'd made him read it 4 times last week. He made the call. Ray picked up on the second ring, which was unusual because Ray almost never picked up before the 4th, and his first words were, I was wondering when you were going to call me. Logan stopped. What does that mean? It means I've been watching some noise in the federal monitoring channels for the past 3 hours that I don't like, and I've been sitting here thinking that if I were in trouble, Logan Veyron is one of maybe 4 people I'd want to know about it. A pause. You're not in trouble, are you? Not yet. I need information, and I need it clean. How clean? Off every network you've ever heard of. A longer pause. Okay, tell me. Logan told him. Not everything. Not Amelia's name, not the specific details of the documentation, but enough. The crash, the vehicle, the target, the name at the center of it. He heard the silence on Ray's end stretch out in a particular way that he recognized as Ray running mental calculations. Adrian Mercer, Ray said finally. Flat, no inflection. You know him? I know of him. I've seen his name attached to a few things that crossed my desk before I left the NSA. Nothing I could act on, nothing conclusive. More like a pattern that showed up in the margins. Another pause. Logan, if Mercer is actually running what you're describing, and someone is moving assets to clean up loose ends, you need to understand something. Tell me. He won't have sent civilians. He'll have people, trained people, with resources and current intelligence access that's good enough to find a cell phone signal on a fog-covered Oregon coast. Logan looked at the Lorax book on the nightstand. I know. Does your daughter... She's at a friend's house. She's out of the picture for now. Good. Keep her there, Ray exhaled. Give me 2 hours. I'll find out what I can about the current operational posture, whether anyone's actively searching, whether there are any location queries on your name, any of it. But Logan, 2 hours and then you move. Don't wait longer than that at your current location. Understood. He went back to the living room. Amelia looked at him with a question on her face that she didn't put into words. 2 hours, he said. Then we need to leave. She didn't argue. Instead, she said, There's something else I need to tell you. About Mercer specifically. He sat back down. I'm listening. She had been holding this piece back, he realized. Not strategically, not as a manipulation, but the way people held back the things that were hardest to say, because once you said them out loud, they became real in a different way. He could see it in the slight adjustment of her posture before she spoke. Daniel's documentation includes communications, she said, internal communications between Mercer and his primary partners in the network. Most of it is logistics, financial instructions, operational planning. She met his eyes. But there are also communications about you. The room was very quiet. About me, Logan said. Going back about 8 months. After I engaged the federal committee, someone ran a background analysis on potential risks to the operation. People who might complicate things if the investigation became active. Your name came up in the context of your relationship with Mercer. The concern was that you might be contacted, either by investigators or by Amelia. She paused, corrected herself. By me, if things escalated. What was the conclusion? That you were manageable, that your discharge, your daughter, your removal from any active network made you a low-priority concern. Something in her voice was careful. But there's a more recent communication from about 6 weeks ago, after my testimony date was set. Logan waited. Mercer wrote to one of his partners that if the situation became critical, you could be used. She said it steady and direct. Not contacted, not managed, used, as a liability. Your history with him, your knowledge of certain operations, he indicated he could surface information that would reframe your record in a way that would put you under federal scrutiny. The shape of it became clear to Logan very quickly, the way threat assessments always did once you had enough of the picture. It wasn't complicated, it was actually elegant, in the way that really ugly things sometimes were. If Mercer needed to redirect attention away from himself, a former SEAL with a personal connection to the operation, someone who could be painted as disgruntled, as having motive, as having exactly the skill set required to orchestrate something like this, was a convenient alternative narrative. He was building a frame, Logan said. Yes. Before he even needed it, just in case. That's what the communications suggest. Logan sat with that for a moment. Ranger had lifted his head and was watching Logan with the particular attentiveness he showed when Logan's body language shifted into a register the dog associated with something coming. He taught me that, Logan said quietly. Not angry, not devastated. More like someone identifying a thing they should have seen a long time ago and hadn't. Always build your contingencies before you need them. Never improvise your exit strategy. He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I thought he was talking about combat operations. Amelia didn't say anything. She had the sense to let that sit. After a moment, Logan stood. I need to check the perimeter and pack what we need. Can you walk? Yes. You sure? Because yes, when you mean probably, is going to be a problem. She looked at him with an expression that suggested she appreciated the directness, even if she wasn't going to admit it. I can walk, Logan. He packed light and fast. 2 bags, one tactical, one for Emma's things because Emma would need to stay away from the house for longer than one night, and he needed to get her some of her things without tipping anyone off to where she was. Clean clothes, the go bag he kept in the closet that Emma thought was full of camping supplies, and that he'd never found the right way to explain to her, Ranger's kit, the 2 burner phones he kept in the kitchen drawer next to the extra batteries and the flashlights. He also took the photograph off the mantel. Him and Emma, taken at the coast last summer. She was sitting on his shoulders with her arms out like she was flying, laughing at something off camera, and Logan below her was looking up at her instead of at the camera. He didn't know why he took it. He just did. Amelia watched him do it and didn't comment. He was checking the back of the property when the burner phone buzzed. Ray. 40 minutes early, which told Logan before he even answered that whatever Ray had found wasn't good. "Talk to me," he said. "Location query on your registered address came through a federal law enforcement channel 45 minutes ago." Ray's voice was stripped down to its operational register, all the casual warmth gone. Not a standard query. It was run through a secondary access point, someone with federal credentials using a non-primary pathway, which is what people do when they want results without leaving a clean audit trail. "I can't confirm the origin, but the signature matches a pattern I've seen before in Mercer-adjacent traffic. They know where I live. They know your address. Whether they're moving on it yet, I can't say. But Logan," Ray stopped. "There's something else. Go." The federal committee proceeding, the sealed testimony, a pause. "It's been flagged internally as a potential security risk. There's a motion in front of a federal judge submitted this morning through a national security review process to suspend the proceeding pending an investigation into the integrity of the evidence chain." Logan understood immediately. Mercer is shutting it down through official channels. Trying to. The motion cites concerns about the provenance of the evidence and names a potential person of interest in the alleged evidence tampering. Ray's voice was very level. "Logan, the name in the motion is yours." He stood in his backyard with the fog still heavy on the property line and the sound of the ocean somewhere below the cliffs and the weight of what Ray had just told him settling into his chest like something physical. His name. In a federal motion. Submitted this morning while he'd been pulling Amelia Voss out of a burning vehicle. Mercer hadn't waited to see if he needed the frame. He'd deployed it the moment he knew the crash had failed. He knew she survived, Logan said, or he assumed it was possible and moved immediately. "Either way, you're now officially a person of interest in a federal proceeding, which means anyone you contact through standard channels is going to flag, and anyone who helps you is going to need a very clean reason for doing so." Ray paused. "I'm sorry, man. I genuinely am." Logan looked back at the house through the kitchen window. He could see Amelia on the couch, holding herself careful and straight, looking at something on the coffee table with a focused expression that told him she was thinking 3 moves ahead even now. "Can you get the information about the motion to the right people?" Logan asked. "Not through channels Mercer can touch. I have one contact at DOJ who I trust completely and who operates independently enough that Mercer's network would need significant lead time to compromise her. I can try. No promises." "Try." Logan turned back toward the house. "And Ray, the operation tonight, if they come to the address, I'll send you a heads up the second I see anything move in the monitoring data. But Logan, do not wait for the heads up. Move now." He ended the call, went back inside. Amelia looked up at him the moment he came through the door, reading something in his face before he said a word. "They know about you," she said. Not a question. "They've put my name into a federal proceeding. Evidence tampering, probably." He picked up the tactical bag and slung it over one shoulder. "Which means this is no longer just about keeping you safe until the testimony. It's about staying free long enough to get the evidence in front of someone who can actually use it." She stood up slowly, cradling the splinted arm. She was pale, and the bandage on her head had a faint rust-colored stain where the wound had seeped a little through the gauze, and she moved like someone working through pain they'd decided not to give permission to stop them. But she stood up. "Where are we going?" she said. Logan looked at Ranger, who was already at the door. "Somewhere that doesn't show up in any file with my name on it," he said. "Someone I haven't spoken to in 2 years, and who I know for a fact has never been connected to anything in my operational history." He picked up the photograph of Emma off the counter where he'd set it, put it in the bag. "And then," he said, "we need to talk to Emma's school again, because my daughter is going to need to stay with Caitlin's family longer than one night, and I need to tell them something that isn't going to make them call the police." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things. But Amelia heard something underneath it that he probably hadn't meant to let through. The particular weight that came from being a person who had learned how to manage danger and hadn't yet learned how to keep it from touching everything he loved. She didn't say anything about it. She just picked up the smaller bag with her good hand and followed him to the door. Outside, the fog was still holding. The ocean was invisible somewhere below the cliffs, nothing but sound. Ranger moved ahead of both of them, nose down, reading the air in front of them the way he always did. The truck started on the first try. Logan backed out of the driveway without headlights, turned onto the access road, and pointed them away from the coast. Neither of them spoke for several miles. The road wound through dark timber, fog-draped and empty, and the only sound was the engine and Ranger shifting his weight in the back seat. And once, the faint sound of Amelia adjusting her arm against the door, and the small breath she made when it hurt. Logan reached across and turned the heater up without being asked. She looked at him sideways. "Your hands were cold in the house," he said. Shock response. "You're probably still running low on circulation." "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, kept his eyes on the road. After another mile or so, she said, "You didn't have to do any of this." "I know. Most people would have called 911 and walked away." He thought about that for a moment, about the photograph in the bag, about Daniel Reeves, who had been 31 years old and careful and scared, and had come forward anyway because he thought it mattered. "Most people didn't find you," he said. She didn't answer that. But somewhere in the darkness of the truck cab, something in her posture changed. Not much, just enough that Ranger, who noticed everything, put his head on her shoulder from the back seat, and this time she didn't pull away. The road ahead disappeared into the fog, and then reappeared, disappeared, and reappeared, mile after mile, carrying them away from everything that Logan Veyron had spent 4 years trying to build. He kept driving. They drove for 2.5 hours before Logan pulled off the highway. Not because they'd arrived anywhere. Because the burner phone had buzzed twice in the last 40 minutes, with texts from Ray that Logan had been reading at red lights and rest stops, and the picture those texts were assembling was bad enough that he needed to stop moving and actually think. He pulled into the parking lot of a closed hardware store somewhere east of Eugene, cut the engine, and read the messages properly. Ray had found movement on Logan's home address, a vehicle parked on the access road at 1140 that hadn't been there at 1115. Not a neighbor's car. A rental registered to a corporate account that traced back through 2 intermediary companies before disappearing into a Delaware LLC with no public officers. Ray had also found a secondary location query, this one on Logan's daughter's school enrollment records, which meant someone had run Emma's name through an education database, which meant... Logan put the phone down on the dashboard. Amelia was watching him from the passenger seat. She'd been awake the whole drive, not talking much, doing the things she seemed to do when she was working through something, going very still and very quiet, in a way that didn't read as passive but as concentrated, like a machine running at full capacity with all the exterior noise turned off. "My daughter's school," Logan said. They ran her records. A beat of silence. To find leverage, or a location. He stared through the windshield at the dark hardware store, at a hand-painted sign in the window advertising a spring sale that had probably happened 3 months ago. Emma's with her friend Caitlin, Caitlin's family. I told the school she'd be staying there, but I didn't say for how long, and I didn't give them a reason, which means if someone calls the school tomorrow morning and asks the right questions in the right way, they'll know where she is. He picked up the phone again, dialed a number he knew by memory. It rang 4 times, 4.5 actually, which was unusual. And then a woman's voice answered, thick with sleep and not particularly happy about it. "Logan, it's past midnight." "I know, Karen. I'm sorry." He meant it. Karen Holt had been his neighbor for 3 years and had watched Emma more times than he could count, and he was calling her past midnight to ask her to do something that was going to sound insane. "I need a favor, a significant one." Karen was quiet for a moment. She'd known Logan long enough to understand that when he said significant, he wasn't being dramatic. "What do you need?" "Caitlin's family said, the Garcias. You know them?" "Sandra Garcia?" "Yes, from the school board meetings." "I need you to go to Sandra Garcia's house tonight, right now. Tell her there's been a family situation and Emma needs to move. Bring her to your place. Don't call ahead, don't text, just go." He paused. "And Karen, don't use your regular phone after this. Don't call me back on this number. I'm going to send you a different number tomorrow morning." The silence on Karen's end lasted long enough that Logan started to worry. Then, "Is Emma in danger?" "Not if we move her tonight." "Okay," Karen said. Just that. No questions, no conditions, no what on earth is happening, just the flat, immediate okay of someone who had decided that the details could wait. "I'll go now." "Thank you," he said. And then, because it felt necessary and insufficient at the same time, "I'll explain everything when I can." He ended the call, sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. "She didn't ask questions," Amelia said quietly. "No. People like that are rare." Logan set the phone down. "I know." He started the engine. "We need to keep moving." The place he was taking them was a hunting cabin in the Cascade foothills, about 60 miles southeast of where they were now. It belonged to a man named Curtis Webb, former Army Ranger, not SEAL, which was a distinction that mattered in certain contexts and meant absolutely nothing in others, who had retired from service about 6 years ago and now ran a small outfitting operation in the mountains, and had, as far as Logan was aware, no digital footprint to speak of beyond a bare-bones website with a contact form that went to an email address Curtis checked roughly once a week. Logan had met Curtis once. At a Veterans Resource event 3 years ago, one of those things that Logan had attended mostly because Emma's teacher had suggested it might be good for him, and he'd been trying, at that point, to be the kind of father who took suggestions from his daughter's teacher. They'd spent about 40 minutes talking in the parking lot after the main event, the way veterans sometimes did, not about anything significant, just finding the common language, the shared context that made certain things easier. At the end of it, Curtis had handed him a card with the cabin's coordinates written on the back in pencil and said, "If you ever need somewhere that doesn't exist, this is where you go." Then he'd driven away in a truck with 300,000 miles on it, and Logan had put the card in his wallet and not thought about it again until tonight. The card was still there. He'd checked while Amelia was sleeping for a short stretch somewhere past midnight, her head against the window, her splinted arm carefully braced against her stomach. She wasn't sleeping now. She was watching the road the way she'd been watching it for the last hour. Not anxious exactly, but alert. He'd noticed she positioned herself so she could see both the side mirror and the road ahead without turning her head. Old habit from someone who'd spent years in corporate security environments, maybe. Or maybe just the particular awareness that developed when someone had tried to kill you and you understood they were probably going to try again. "Can I ask you something?" she said, somewhere around 1 a.m. "Go ahead." "Your daughter, Emma." A pause. "How old is she?" Logan glanced at her sideways. 7. "What does she know about your background?" He thought about how to answer that. "She knows I was in the Navy. She knows I had a dog partner named Ranger. She knows I did some things that I'm not able to tell her about yet." He watched the road. "She's 7. She mostly wants to know if we can get a second dog and whether I'll let her paint her bedroom purple." Both reasonable requests. "The purple is under negotiation." Amelia made a sound that might have been a small laugh. It faded quickly, but it had been there. "Her mother?" Logan's jaw moved slightly. "Not in the picture. By choice. Her choice, not mine. She left when Emma was 2. He kept his voice level. "Emma asks about her sometimes. I tell her the truth as much as I can, which is that some people aren't built for the things they thought they were, and that doesn't mean anything about Emma." "Do you believe that?" "I believe Emma deserves to believe it." Amelia looked at him for a moment, then she turned back to the window. They reached the cabin at 2:47 in the morning. It was exactly what Logan had expected from a man like Curtis Webb. Functional, deliberately unimpressive, the kind of place that someone passing on the access road wouldn't look at twice. A single-story structure backed into a tree line, propane tank on the east side, a covered storage area with firewood stacked to the roof, a hand pump for the well out front that Logan really hoped was supplemented by an indoor water line because Amelia's head wound still needed cleaning. There was a lockbox on the door, combination written in pencil on the back of the card. Inside, the cabin was Spartan, but not neglected. Cots in the main room, a wood stove, a camp kitchen with a propane two-burner setup, a hand-crank emergency radio on a shelf next to a stack of topographic maps, and a first aid kit that was actually well-stocked, which Logan appreciated more than he could say. He got Amelia situated on one of the cots, checked the head wound, still seeping slightly, but not in a way that scared him. The original suture work he'd done at the house had held, and changed the gauze while she held herself still with the same controlled patience she brought to everything that hurt. Then he took stock of the first aid kit, the food supplies in the cabinet, the maps. Ranger investigated the entire cabin perimeter twice, came back in, ate from the travel bag of food Logan had packed, and positioned himself beside the door with his nose pointed at the gap at the bottom. Monitoring. Always monitoring. Logan sat down with the maps and the burner phone and the tactical bag and tried to think clearly about what the next 36 hours needed to look like. The federal testimony had been scheduled for 11 in the morning, 2 days from now, in Portland. That was 80-some miles from where they were sitting. The motion to suspend the proceeding was in front of a federal judge. Ray had texted an update at midnight saying the judge hadn't ruled yet, that the DOJ contact he'd reached had flagged the motion as potentially compromised, that there were people now paying attention who hadn't been before, which was something. Not enough, but something. What they needed was to get the evidence on that drive in front of the right person before Mercer's legal maneuvering succeeded in closing the proceeding, which meant not Portland. Portland was the obvious destination, the place Mercer's people would be watching. It meant finding a secondary channel, a way to get the information authenticated and into the federal record through a pathway that Mercer couldn't predict or block. Ray was the key to that. But Ray had also made it clear that his own exposure was increasing, that he'd already accessed more restricted data in the last 12 hours than he was comfortable with, and that he needed to go dark for at least 6 hours to avoid triggering any monitoring flags on his own activity, which left Logan in a cabin in the Cascades at 3 in the morning with a broken map, a burner phone with 40% battery, and a woman sleeping on a cot 6 feet away who was carrying evidence that could dismantle a corruption network worth billions if they could survive long enough to deliver it. He put his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for what he told himself would be 5 minutes. He woke up to Ranger's alert sound. Not a bark, never a bark when stealth mattered, just that particular low resonance in the dog's chest that meant something is outside and it doesn't belong there, and came fully awake instantly the way he'd trained himself to do years ago and had never quite stopped. Light through the cabin windows. Early morning, 6 or 7, the particular gray gold that came before the sun cleared the ridgeline. He was at the window before Amelia stirred on the cot. He looked out. A truck on the access road, parked, not moving. Different from the road in, the upper track, the one that came in from the Forest Service route. Someone who knew the secondary approach. His hand was on his sidearm. The Glock from the tactical bag, loaded, one in the chamber, the way it always was in the bag, because an unloaded emergency firearm was a philosophical statement, not a tool, before he'd consciously decided to reach for it. Amelia was awake. She'd moved from the cot to the floor without him telling her to, putting herself below window level, which told him she'd either had some tactical training at some point or her instincts were very good. Both possible. "How many?" she said, barely above a whisper. "One vehicle. Can't see how many inside." He watched. The truck wasn't moving, no one getting out, just sitting there on the track, engine off. Then the door of the truck opened and a man got out. Heavy set, 60-something, moving with the particular deliberateness of someone whose knees had given him trouble for a while. He put his hands up as he walked toward the cabin. Visible, open, no theater about it, just the immediate and practiced gesture of someone who understood what the situation looked like and wanted to defuse it before it escalated. Logan recognized him 10 feet from the window. Curtis Webb. He let out a breath and uncocked the hammer and put the Glock on the shelf by the window, barrel pointed at the wall. "It's the man who owns this place," he told Amelia. "Stay put." He opened the door. Curtis stopped about 8 feet out, hands still visible, and looked at Logan with an expression that was tired and calm and not particularly surprised. "Saw your plates on the access camera," Curtis said. His voice was like gravel processed through a longer geological period than usual. "Trail camera, solar-powered, sends a picture to my phone when anything comes up the road. Most of the time it's deer." He lowered his hands. "You look rough." "I've had a long night, I imagine." Curtis looked past him at the cabin interior. "How many?" "2. And the dog." Curtis nodded. "I'm not going to ask questions you don't want to answer, but I'm going to tell you that I drove by your access road about 20 minutes ago because I like to know what's in my woods in the morning, and there's a black SUV parked on the Forest Service Road about 2 miles east with 2 men in it who look like they're waiting for something." He met Logan's eyes. "I've been in enough situations to know what that means." Logan's chest went tight. 2 miles. They'd been found faster than he'd thought. Not his plates. He'd switched to Curtis's access road in the dark. No cameras on the main approach. But the truck itself, maybe. Or a monitoring pattern Ray hadn't been able to see. Either way. "How long have they been there?" Logan said. "Couldn't tell you for certain. They were there when I came up at 6. Could have been all night." "You didn't call anyone." Curtis looked at him with an expression that said the question was slightly insulting. "I called you," he said, "through the card. If you'd answered your number, we wouldn't be having this conversation on the porch." He paused. "I'm assuming the woman inside has something to do with why those men are in my woods." "Yes." "Is she the one who was on the news this morning?" Logan went very still. "What news?" Curtis pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and held it out. A local news alert on the screen, time-stamped 5:47 a.m. The headline read, "CEO of Voss Defense Systems missing. Following suspected vehicle accident. Federal investigation underway." The article beneath it was carefully constructed. It described Amelia Voss as missing following a suspected single-vehicle accident on the coastal highway. It mentioned that federal investigators were treating the case as active. And in the 4th paragraph, almost as an aside, it named a person of interest in the Federal Evidence Review. Logan's name, his rank, his history, and a statement from a federal spokesperson Logan had never heard of, confirming that investigators were seeking his cooperation. His photograph was attached. His actual photograph, yeah. Not a file photo. Not something pulled from a public record. A photograph taken at a distance, candidly, him and Emma at what looked like a park. Taken without his knowledge. It was dated, according to the metadata Curtis showed him, 4 months ago. Mercer had been watching him for 4 months. He handed the phone back to Curtis. His hands were steady. He made sure of it. "I need 2 things from you," Logan said, "and you can say no to both." Curtis pocketed the phone. "I'm listening." "First, a different vehicle. Anything that's not registered to me or connected to anyone I know." He paused. "Second, if you have a way to move across the Forest Service land east of here without going near that road, I run cattle up there. I know every trail on 2,000 acres. Curtis said it flatly. Not a boast, just information. "What's the second thing?" "That is the second thing." Curtis looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the sky, the way men who spent time in the outdoors sometimes did when they were thinking, not for any information the sky was going to give them, just as a moment of orientation. "There's a 2009 Chevy pickup in the equipment shed," Curtis said. "Registered to the outfitting business. No connection to you." He turned toward the shed. "Give me 10 minutes." Logan went back inside. Amelia was standing now, holding her arm and reading the news article on Logan's phone. He'd pulled it up on the burner to confirm what Curtis had shown him. Her expression was the one she wore when she was containing something that would be easier to let out. "They're framing it as a missing person case," she said, "with me as the person of interest, which means anyone we approach through official channels is going to flag you immediately. Yes." She set the phone down. "The judge hasn't ruled yet on the motion to suspend." "How do you know that?" "Because if the judge had ruled, the article would have mentioned the federal proceeding. The fact that it doesn't means the proceeding is still technically active. She looked at him. We still have a window. If we can get the drive authenticated and submitted through a secondary channel before the ruling, Ray mentioned a DOJ contact. Is she reliable? Ray says yes. Then that's the path. Amelia picked up her bag with her good hand and slung it over her shoulder. The movement cost her. He could see it in the set of her jaw. She didn't mention it. What's the vehicle situation? We have one. New plates. No connection to either of us. He picked up the tactical bag, Ranger's kit, everything they'd brought in. And we have a route out that doesn't go near the road where Mercer's people are sitting. She nodded, started for the door. Amelia? She stopped, turned. The photograph in the article, Logan said. It was taken 4 months ago, me and Emma at Riverside Park. He watched her face. He's been watching both of us for a long time, which means he understands that Emma is the pressure point. He said it with no particular emotion, the way he'd learned to deliver information that mattered too much to afford emotion. I need you to understand that going forward, I cannot allow concern about my daughter to affect the decisions I make about this operation. Because if I do, Mercer wins. Amelia looked at him for a long moment. She's safe, she said. You moved her last night. For now. For now is all anyone ever has. She held his gaze. And for what it's worth, I understand what it costs to say what you just said. Most people wouldn't have said it out loud. He picked up the last bag and followed her to the door. Curtis was waiting by the Chevy pickup, engine running, the particular look on his face of a man who'd decided the details of a situation were above his pay grade and was operating on the simpler principle that the right thing was the right thing. He handed Logan the keys without ceremony. Trail east of the equipment shed goes 2 miles through the timber before it hits the old forest road, Curtis said. Take the old road north for 4 miles. You'll come out on the county highway. They won't see you leave. I owe you, Logan said. Curtis made a sound. Buy me a beer sometime. He looked at Amelia, and his expression shifted slightly. Not recognition, exactly, but the particular look of someone reassessing a situation they thought they understood. You the one they're looking for? Amelia looked at him steadily. Yes. You do what you need to do, Curtis said simply. Then he stepped back and walked toward the cabin, hands in his pockets, done with the conversation in the way that people from that generation were done with things, completely, without ceremony, moving directly to the next thing that needed doing. Logan got in the truck. Ranger took the back seat. Amelia took the passenger side and closed the door and sat straight with her arm braced and her eyes already forward. The trail through the timber was rough enough that the truck bottomed out twice in the first mile, and Logan drove it at a crawl with the headlights off because the morning light was barely enough, but it was enough. Ranger kept his nose at the window seam. Amelia didn't talk, which Logan appreciated because the thinking he needed to do required quiet. They had a vehicle that bought them maybe a day before it could be traced. They had Ray in the background burning his own exposure to help them. They had a DOJ contact who might be their only legitimate path to getting the evidence into the right hands before the proceeding got shut down. They had the drive, sewn into the lining of Amelia's collar, carrying enough documentation to dismantle 6 years of a carefully constructed criminal operation. And they had Mercer, who was not waiting, who was adjusting, who had been 3 moves ahead of this situation for months and was now working to get 4 moves ahead, because that was what Mercer did. That was what Logan had watched him do for 7 years, always thinking further out than the person across from him, always building the contingency before it was needed. Logan had learned that from him. He drove through the trees, gray morning light filtering through the canopy, and thought about everything Mercer had taught him and what it meant that he was going to have to use all of it against the man who'd taught it. The old forest road was empty when they reached it. He turned north, picked up speed, and by the time the county highway appeared ahead of them through the tree line, a watery sun was beginning to crest the ridgeline to the east, washing the road in pale gold light that didn't feel like hope exactly, but felt like time. A little more of it, which was the only currency that mattered right now. His burner phone buzzed. Ray. The text was 3 words. She'll meet you. The DOJ contact. Logan exhaled slowly, showed the screen to Amelia without comment. She read it, looked up at the road ahead. Where? He typed the question to Ray, waited. 40 seconds, then the response. He read the location, looked at the fuel gauge, looked at the time, ran the math in his head with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd planned routes under worse conditions, in worse shape, with considerably less at stake. 4 hours, he told Amelia. If we don't stop. She didn't hesitate. Then we don't stop. He put the phone in his pocket and kept driving, the road unspooling ahead of them into a morning that was growing lighter by the mile, carrying everything they had left toward the only play that remained. The DOJ contact's name was Nora Vance, and she was nothing like Logan had expected. He'd built a mental image during the 4-hour drive, a senior attorney, buttoned up, the kind of careful institutional person who weighed every word twice before releasing it. What met them in the parking structure of a mid-sized hotel in Salem was a woman in her late 40s wearing a rain jacket over what looked like yesterday's clothes, hair pulled back in the hasty way of someone who'd been working through the night, carrying a battered leather bag that had seen a decade of hard use and hadn't been replaced because she hadn't gotten around to it. She looked at Logan, looked at Amelia, looked at the splinted arm and the bandaged head and the dog, and said, "You look worse than Ray described, and he described it pretty bad." "We had a difficult morning," Logan said. "I gathered." She glanced around the parking structure with the automatic awareness of someone who'd spent years assessing environments. "My car, second level. Let's not stand here." Her car was a 10-year-old Honda with a cracked dashboard and a cardboard box of case files on the back seat that Ranger had to navigate around. She drove them to the hotel's lower level, a dead zone for most signals, parked, and turned to face them. "Before anything else," she said, looking at Amelia, "I need you to understand what I can and can't do. I'm not here in any official capacity. I came because Ray asked me to, and because I've been watching the motion on Mercer's proceeding with a growing sense that something is badly wrong with the institutional response to it." She paused. "The judge has not ruled yet. As of 90 minutes ago, the motion was still under review. That window exists, but it is closing." "How long?" Amelia asked. "My best estimate is 6 to 8 hours before a ruling, possibly less." Nora looked at the splinted arm. "Is that properly set?" "No," Logan said. At the same time, Amelia said, "It's fine." Nora looked between them. "Okay." She turned back to Amelia. "The drive. I need to understand what's on it before I can advise on the fastest legitimate path to getting it into the federal record in a way that Mercer can't challenge on provenance grounds." Amelia reached up and worked the small seam at the inside of her collar with her good hand. It took a moment. Logan could see the effort of doing it one-handed, the slight tension in her fingers. And then a flat drive, no larger than a thumb, came free from the lining. She held it out to Nora. Nora took it, looked at it, turned it over once. "Encryption?" "A ES-256 with a key that exists in exactly 2 places," Amelia said. "On this drive and in my memory." "The documentation chain. Is it clean?" Daniel Reeves maintained a timestamp log for every document he acquired. Date, source, method of acquisition, chain of custody from initial discovery to transfer to me. I added to that log for everything I personally compiled afterward. Amelia's voice was steady. "A forensic examiner will be able to authenticate the provenance of every piece of evidence on that drive." Nora looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that was evaluating and not entirely comfortable with what it was finding. "You built this to survive a challenge." "I built it to be airtight," Amelia said, "because I knew that whoever I was building it against would have the resources to challenge everything." Nora set the drive carefully on the center console. "There's a federal magistrate in Portland who operates independently of the program offices Mercer's network has influenced. I've worked with her before. If I can get this drive to her with a sworn affidavit from you and a chain of custody certification, she has the authority to admit it into the federal record as protected evidence, which triggers mandatory review protocols that supersede the suspension motion." She looked at Logan. "That's the path." "What's the problem with the path?" Logan said, because there was clearly a problem with the path. "The problem," Nora said, "is that doing this on a timeline of 6 to 8 hours, with Mercer's people actively looking for both of you, means I need to move openly. I can't do this from the shadows. I file the affidavit, my name goes on it, and Mercer will know immediately that we've found a workaround." She met Logan's eyes. which means he'll stop trying to use the legal process to shut this down and start trying to shut it down the other way. He'll move on us directly, Logan said. Tonight, Nora confirmed. If I file this afternoon, which I have to do to make the timeline, he'll know by early evening. And he'll know that the evidence is still with you until I can arrange protective custody, because the magistrate's office will need to process the filing before any federal protective detail is authorized. She looked at Logan steadily. You're going to need somewhere to be tonight that you can defend. Logan thought of the cabin. Curtis's cabin, which was already blown. Mercer's people had been parked on the forest road, which meant they might have ID'd the location even if they hadn't seen them leave. He thought of every other option available to him, running through the practical geography of where they were and what resources existed within reach. He thought of what he'd said to Amelia that morning about Emma, about not letting concern for his daughter affect his operational decisions. He thought about it, and then he set it aside, and he thought about the problem in front of him. There's a way, he said, but I need a few hours to set it up. Nora nodded once. I'll drive to Portland now and begin the filing process. You have my number. She looked at Amelia. I need the decryption key before I go. Amelia recited a 22-character string from memory without hesitation. Nora wrote it on a piece of paper, actual paper, which Logan noticed, and put it in her jacket pocket. Don't use this number after 3 p.m., Nora said, giving Logan a card with a different number handwritten on the back. Use this one. It's clean. She started the car. Stay alive until morning. That's the entire job. She drove them back to the parking structure, let them out, and was gone before Logan had finished processing the conversation. He stood in the parking structure with Amelia beside him and Ranger pressing against his leg, and the particular stillness that came in the moment after a plan was set and before the execution began. You said there's a way, Amelia said. What is it? Curtis's cabin is compromised, Logan said, but there's a second structure on his property, a deer blind, elevated, built into the tree line on the north ridge. I saw it on his topo map this morning. He looked at her. It's not a cabin, it has no heat source, and it's going to be cold tonight. But it has a clear sight line to both access roads, and it's invisible from the ground. Amelia processed this. You want to go back to Curtis's property. Mercer's people found the main cabin because they knew roughly where to look. They ran the plates, they had the access road, they found it. But they don't know about the ridge structure because it's not on any survey map, and Curtis didn't mention it to anyone who would have mentioned it to them. He watched her face. Going back is the last thing they'll expect. It's also the only ground I know well enough to defend. She was quiet for a moment. And Curtis? I need to call him. He pulled the burner. He'll say yes or he'll say no. Either way, we know where we stand. Curtis said yes, no hesitation, same as before, same flat matter-of-fact tone that Logan was beginning to understand wasn't indifference, but a particular kind of quiet commitment. He also said he'd leave the topo map with the ridge structure marked on the equipment shed door, and that there were 2 propane camp heaters in the shed's east corner that Logan could take, and that he'd be in his house with his doors locked and his phone off because what he didn't know about couldn't put him in a witness chair. That's probably smart, Logan said. I've been smart before, Curtis said. It's worked out both times. He hung up. The drive back to the foothills took 2 hours. Logan stopped once for fuel, paid cash from the emergency money in the tactical bag, kept the stop under 4 minutes. Amelia used the time to close her eyes, not sleeping but resting. A discipline he recognized, the ability to extract recovery from moments that weren't long enough for actual sleep. He'd learned it in the field and never entirely stopped using it. The fact that she did it suggested someone had taught her at some point, or that she'd arrived at it the same way he had, through enough situations where full sleep was a luxury and the body learned to take what it could get. The equipment shed was open when they arrived, map on the door as promised. Logan studied it for 3 minutes, committed the ridge structure location to memory, and led them up the north trail into the timber. The blind was better than he'd hoped and harder to reach than he'd expected. 40 feet up a Douglas fir with a platform structure built around the trunk, solid, weatherproofed, built by someone who knew what they were doing, accessible by a wooden ladder that Curtis had pulled up and left at the base. The platform was roughly 12 by 8 feet, with 3/4 walls and a roof, open on the south face looking down over both approach roads. Just enough space for 2 people, a dog, and the gear. Getting Amelia up a 40-foot ladder with one functional arm was the kind of problem that didn't have a clean solution. They worked it out together, slowly and without grace. Logan above, Amelia below, Ranger watching from the base with an expression that suggested he was deeply skeptical of this entire plan. At the top, Amelia sat down on the platform with her back against the trunk and breathed carefully through her nose for about 30 seconds. "I'm fine," she said preemptively. "I didn't say anything." "You were about to." He pulled up the ladder, secured it to the platform rail, and set up the camp heaters. The sun was dropping, the temperature with it, the particular cold of a mountain evening in timber country that went straight through anything that wasn't rated for it. He gave Amelia his outer layer, which she tried to refuse and then accepted because she was cold, and they were past the point where small dignities were worth the cost. They ate from the emergency rations in the bag, nothing worth describing, the kind of food that existed purely as fuel, and settled in to wait. This was always the hardest part. Logan had learned that in his first year in the teams and had never stopped learning it because waiting was the part where the mind went to all the places it was better off not going. The what-ifs, the variables outside your control, the faces of the people you were responsible for. He was thinking about Emma. He couldn't entirely stop, and he'd stopped trying to entirely stop when Amelia said, "Tell me something about her." He looked at her. She was sitting with her back straight, which was constant, but her head was tilted back against the tree trunk, and her eyes were not entirely focused on anything in front of her, which was the closest he'd seen her come to actually resting since the couch at his house. "Emma," he said. "Yes." He thought for a moment. "She argues with me about bedtime by citing precedent. She told me last month that since I'd let her stay up until 9:30 on a Friday 3 weeks ago, that had established a pattern, and patterns constituted implicit agreements." Amelia looked at him. "She's 7. I know." "Where does she get that?" Logan looked out at the south face, the darkening tree line, the road below barely visible through the foliage. "Her teacher thinks she's going to be a lawyer. I think she's going to be whatever she decides she's going to be, and the rest of us will just have to adjust." A quiet moment. The wind moved through the canopy above them, cold and smelling of pine resin and rain that hadn't arrived yet. "I never wanted children," Amelia said. Not as a confession, just as a fact she was turning over. "I thought it was a decision I'd made clearly and purposefully. My career, my company, the work I was doing, it required everything I had. A child would have required everything I had. The math didn't work. And now?" She was quiet for a moment. "I watched you drive for 4 hours on no sleep, planning 3 moves ahead, while simultaneously managing your concern about a 7-year-old to a degree that most people couldn't achieve, and I thought—" She paused. "I thought the math was always wrong. The way I was doing it." Logan didn't answer that. He wasn't sure there was an answer. He was also aware, in the back of his mind, that this was the kind of conversation that happened between people who'd been through something together and stripped away the professional distance, and that in the morning, in different circumstances, it would feel different. Maybe awkward, maybe necessary. He didn't know. He was too tired and too focused on the tree line below to work it out. "Try to sleep," he said instead. "I'll take first watch." "I'm not going to sleep. You're running on shock response, pain, and stubbornness. Your body is going to override all of that in the next 30 minutes, whether you cooperate or not." He looked at her. "Sleep while it's voluntary." She opened her mouth, closed it. Then, with the specific expression of someone acknowledging a valid point they are not happy about, she shifted her position against the trunk and closed her eyes. She was asleep in 20 minutes. He'd been right about the 30, but not by much. Logan sat with the Glock in his lap and Ranger awake beside him, and watched the roads below, and the timber on both sides and the sky above the canopy, where the clouds had moved in and erased the stars entirely, leaving a flat darkness that felt close and heavy. The call came at 9:47 p.m., Nora's clean number. "It's filed," she said. The magistrate received it at 7:12 and signed the evidence protection order at 9:30. The drive's content is now in the federal record. Mercer's suspension motion is functionally moot. Once the evidence is in as protected, the motion has no mechanism to affect it. A pause. The formal ruling will come in the morning, but legally, it's done. Logan let out a breath he'd been holding for most of the day. Any response from Mercer's side? His attorneys filed an emergency challenge at 9:52. The magistrate declined to hear it without a formal session, which won't happen until morning. Nora's voice was level, but underneath it, he could hear something that had been very tightly contained for the last several hours starting to loosen slightly. The problem is the legal situation and the operational situation are running on different timelines. The law says the evidence is protected. Mercer doesn't care what the law says tonight. He'll move. He's already moving. I picked up a communication through a channel I'm not going to specify that suggests a team was repositioned about an hour ago. I don't know the target location, but Logan... She stopped. He knows about Curtis Webb. I don't know how, but the connection was surfaced somehow. The property is a known quantity. Logan's eyes went immediately to the road below. Nothing moving. Not yet. How long? I don't know. Soon. Be ready. Another pause. There are federal agents moving toward your area. I've managed to get a location ping to people I trust inside the FBI's Organized Crime Division, people outside Mercer's network. They're approximately 90 minutes out. You need to hold for 90 minutes. Understood. Logan. Her voice shifted slightly. Don't die. I just filed about 40 pages of work, and I'd like there to be people alive to testify to the supporting record. He almost smiled at that. Copy that. He woke Amelia with a hand on her shoulder, quiet and immediate. She came awake the way she'd done at his house, suddenly, completely, scanning without giving herself time to be confused about where she was. It's time, he said. She understood what that meant. She sat up, checked her arm by reflex, and met his eyes. How many? Don't know yet. Could be the 2 from this morning, could be more. He handed her the backup piece from the tactical bag, a compact 9mm he'd been carrying for years, older, reliable. Do you know how to use this? She took it, checked the chamber, engaged and disengaged the safety with practiced efficiency. Yes. He noted that without comment. There were layers to Amelia Voss that kept revealing themselves at intervals, and he'd stopped being surprised by them. Ranger had moved to the south opening of the platform, nose working hard, ears forward. That was the first indicator. The dog's posture was the posture of something confirmed, not suspected. They're close, Logan said quietly. They came from the east access road first, 2 figures moving through the timber below, using the tree cover, moving with the disciplined spacing of trained personnel, not rushing, methodical. The way professionals moved when they were confident in their position and weren't expecting resistance from 40 feet up. Then a third figure, coming in from the north along the ridge trail, covering the retreat. 3 that he could see. Possibly more on the west side that the platform's angle didn't show him. Logan watched them move through the dark below. He watched their spacing, their timing, the way they communicated with hand signals he recognized from his own training. He watched the way the lead figure paused at the base of the main cabin, assessed, signaled the second to circle, and that economy of movement, that specific shorthand. He knew that shorthand. He'd learned it from the same person. Logan? Amelia's voice was very quiet beside him. She was looking at the north approach. There's a 4th. He shifted, looked north along the ridge where she was pointing. A figure on the trail, above the tree line, moving without a light and moving fast. Too fast for the others. Moving like someone who wasn't leading an approach but following one, someone arriving late to a situation that was already in motion. The figure stopped on the trail below the blind, 50 feet down, facing the cabin. And in the dim ambient light that filtered through the cloud cover, Logan could see the silhouette clearly enough. The posture, the way he stood. Mercer had come himself. Logan had known it was possible. He'd played the scenario in his head on the drive back, during the watch, and the fragments of clear thinking he'd managed between everything else. He told himself it was rational to plan for it. What he hadn't planned for was what it would feel like to actually see it. The man himself, standing in the dark below, come to personally oversee the ending of a problem he'd spent months trying to manage from a distance. He was 61 years old, and he still moved like a threat. Logan's hand was steady on the Glock. His breathing was controlled. He did not feel what he'd expected to feel, which was some version of betrayal or anger or grief for the relationship that this moment was finally and permanently killing. What he felt instead was a flat, clear-eyed recognition of the situation, of the man below him, of what needed to happen. Then Mercer's satellite phone lit up as he made a call, just briefly, just long enough. And Ranger launched, not toward the cabin, down, off the platform, off the 12-foot drop to the lower branch Logan had noted during setup, and that Ranger had assessed with the same operational eye, down again to the ground in a controlled drop that should not have been physically possible for a dog of any age, and that Logan had seen Ranger pull off twice before in situations where the dog had decided waiting was not an option. Mercer heard it a half-second too late. He turned, and Ranger was already on him. Not the throat, not the way untrained people imagined police dogs worked, but the weapon hand, the right wrist, controlled and precise and absolutely committed. And Mercer went down under the weight of it, and the satellite phone hit the dirt, and the call he'd been making cut off. The two figures at the cabin spun toward the sound. Logan went down the ladder with a speed that his shoulders would remind him about for a week. He hit the ground and moved left, using the tree trunk as cover, and called out in the darkness with the voice he'd used for 7 years in conditions considerably noisier than this. "Mercer, call them off." A sound from the ground. Ranger holding, all 85 pounds of him applied to a man who was 61 and fit, but not prepared for 85 pounds of Belgian Malinois applied to his weapon arm at ground level. "Logan!" Mercer's voice came out of the dark, strained, controlled. Still controlled, even now. "Call your dog. Call your team first." A pause that lasted about 3 seconds. Then Mercer said a word, flat and carrying, and the two figures at the cabin stopped moving. Logan could see them in his peripheral vision, both frozen, hands uncertain, the particular posture of people who had received a command that conflicted with their current operational momentum and were waiting to understand what it meant. "Ranger, hold," Logan said. The dog held, maintained contact, maintained position, did not release. Held. Logan stepped out from the tree. He kept the Glock at low ready, not pointed at Mercer, not holstered, at low ready, because the situation was not resolved and he was not going to pretend it was. Mercer was on the ground, weight on his left arm, right wrist held by Ranger's grip. He looked up at Logan with an expression that was genuinely difficult to read. Not fear, not fury. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a man who had arrived at a moment he'd believed he'd controlled and found it had inverted on him. "You found the high ground," Mercer said. "You taught me to always find the high ground." A beat of silence in the dark timber. Wind above. Nothing else moving. "Logan," Mercer's voice shifted slightly. An adjustment of register that Logan recognized as the tone Mercer used when he was about to offer something, not asking exactly, presenting. "This can still be resolved. What she has on that drive is already in the federal record," Logan said. "Filed at 7:12 tonight. Evidence protection order signed at 9:30. He watched Mercer's face in the darkness. "It's done, Colonel. Whatever you came here to finish tonight, it's done." The silence that followed was different from the other silences. Mercer's two men were still frozen at the cabin. The third, from the north approach, hadn't appeared, which meant they'd either stopped when Mercer went down or were somewhere Logan needed to track. Mercer was very still. Then something in his posture changed. Not a collapse, not a surrender in the dramatic sense, but a specific, almost mechanical shift, like a machine reaching the end of its operational program. The tension left his shoulders in a way that was more final than relaxing. "You were always better than I gave you credit for," Mercer said. And that was the worst thing about it, that it sounded genuine, that after everything, it sounded like the thing he meant. "Ranger, release," Logan said. The dog released the wrist, stepped back 2 paces, did not take his eyes off Mercer. Logan kept the Glock at low ready and looked at the man on the ground, the man who had trained him, mentored him, handed him his papers with a handshake, built a frame for him as a contingency. sent people to kill Amelia Voss, and come personally tonight to make sure the job was finished, and felt the weight of all of it in a way that was not satisfying, and was not clean, and was not the way these moments were supposed to feel. "Don't get up," he said. Mercer didn't move. Amelia came down the ladder behind him, slower than Logan, managing it with one arm in a way that was purely functional and not pretty, and got her to the ground. She stood at the tree base and looked at the man in the dirt, and her expression was something Logan hadn't seen on her before, saw not triumph, not vindication, something older than either. The expression of someone who had lost too much getting to this moment to feel anything simple about arriving at it. From the western timber, Logan heard the crack of a branch under a boot. His sidearm came up, and then a figure stepped out of the tree line with both hands visible and empty and said, "Federal agents are 12 minutes out. I'm going to stand very still until they get here." It was the third figure from the north approach. Logan kept the weapon on him until the man's posture fully resolved into the particular kind of cooperative stillness that meant what it appeared to mean. Then he lowered it back to low ready and returned his attention to Mercer on the ground. 12 minutes. He could do 12 minutes. Ranger sat down. The dog had made his assessment, completed his work, and was now in the particular alert rest that meant the immediate crisis had moved into the next phase. Logan stood in the cold timber with the Glock in his hand and the woman who had started this beside him and the man who had tried to end it on the ground at his feet, and he waited. The agents came in 10 minutes, not 12, from the South Access Road with lights on and no sirens, which told him Nora's contacts had understood the requirement for a quiet approach. 6 agents, federal credentials, organized crime division out of Portland. They secured Mercer and his 2 men with a professionalism that Logan noted and appreciated. They took Logan's weapon with the polite firmness of people doing a job and gave him a receipt for it, and they confirmed Amelia's identity through a process that required her drive's decryption, which she provided standing in the timber with her broken arm and her bandaged head, reciting 22 characters from memory without hesitation. The lead agent, a woman named Torres, looked at Logan after the initial processing was complete. "Nora Vance sends regard," she said, "and something about 40 pages of work." "Tell her I got it," Logan said. Torres almost smiled. "We'll need statements from both of you, tonight, if possible." She looked at Amelia. "And we need to get you to a hospital." "Yes," Amelia said without argument, which told Logan how much the last 24 hours had cost her more than anything else she'd said or done. He looked at Mercer, being guided toward the federal vehicle below by 2 agents. Mercer didn't look back. Walked straight, head up, with the bearing of a man who'd spent decades building something and had just watched it come apart from the ground of a mountainside in Oregon, held there by a dog he hadn't accounted for. Logan watched him until he was in the vehicle and the door was closed. He thought about all the things he might feel: anger, grief, relief, vindication, the whole catalog of what a person was supposed to feel when something like this reached its end. He turned them over one by one and found that what was actually there, underneath everything, was simpler and quieter and harder to name. Something like a weight he hadn't known he was carrying, just beginning to shift. Ranger pressed against his leg in the dark. Logan put his hand on the dog's back, between the shoulders, and left it there for a moment. Then Torres was beside him again, patient and professional. "Mr. Veyron, when you're ready." He looked up at the timber, at the blind above, invisible from the ground, exactly as it was supposed to be. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go. The hospital in Salem kept Amelia for 3 days. The orthopedic surgeon who looked at her arm on the first morning used the word remarkable, in a tone that suggested he meant the opposite. Remarkable that she'd been mobile on it. Remarkable that she hadn't done permanent damage. Remarkable that someone had managed field stabilization good enough to prevent the secondary fracture from displacing further. He said all of this while looking at Logan with the particular expression that medical professionals reserved for people who had made improvised decisions in situations that called for professional intervention. Logan didn't argue with the assessment. The surgeon was right. It had been a bad call made in the absence of better options, and the fact that it had worked out didn't retroactively make it a good call. That was something else Mercer had taught him. Outcomes didn't validate methods. You evaluated the decision with the information available at the time, not with the information you got afterward. He'd been thinking about Mercer's lessons a lot in those first few days. turning them over, looking at them from different angles, trying to work out which ones were worth keeping and which ones were contaminated by everything he now knew about the man who'd taught them. It wasn't a clean process. There was no clear line between the mentor and the criminal, no moment he could point to and say that's where one ended and the other began. They were the same person. That was the uncomfortable truth he had to sit with. He was sitting with it in the hospital waiting room on the second morning when his phone rang and the number on the screen was one he hadn't seen in 4 years. He stared at it for a moment. Then he answered, "Logan." The voice on the other end belonged to Rear Admiral James Holt, retired now, the man who had overseen Logan's discharge processing and who had, at the time, been one of 3 people Logan considered genuinely trustworthy at the institutional level. "Admiral," Logan said, "I'm going to skip the part where I explain how I know where you are, because I think we can both agree that's not the interesting part of this conversation." Holt's voice was the same as Logan remembered. Flat, deliberate, the economy of someone who'd spent decades not wasting words. "I want you to know that the review of your service record is complete. The federal motion naming you as a person of interest has been formally withdrawn. As of 6 this morning, your name is clear." Logan absorbed that. The words were simple enough. The weight behind them was not. "The frame Mercer built," Logan said, "dismantled. Completely." A pause. "The evidence on that drive was thorough enough that the investigation expanded significantly within the first 24 hours of intake. We're looking at a network considerably larger than one man and one consulting firm. The number of people who are going to face federal charges in the next 6 to 18 months, Holt stopped. "It's not a small number, Logan." "Daniel Reeves," Logan said, "the analyst. Is there enough to reclassify his death?" A silence on the other end that told him the question had landed somewhere meaningful. "That investigation has been reopened," Holt said carefully. "I can't say more than that, but it's been reopened." It wasn't enough. Logan knew it wasn't enough. That reopening an investigation into a man who'd been dead for months was not the same as justice. That justice for Daniel Reeves was probably going to be partial and delayed and filtered through institutional processes that moved at their own pace regardless of what anyone wanted. But it was something. It was the door opening, which was more than had existed 2 days ago. "I also want you to know," Holt continued, "that there are people at the institutional level who understand what you did, what it cost you to do it." Another pause, shorter. "I'm one of them." Logan looked at the waiting room wall, a generic print of mountains, a water dispenser that had been making a periodic gurgling sound for the last hour. "Thank you, sir," he said, not for the cleared record, for the acknowledgement, which was different and rare and, in some way he couldn't entirely articulate, mattered more. He went to see Emma that afternoon. Karen Holt had kept her for 3 days by telling her that her dad was helping someone who'd been in an accident, which was technically accurate, and that he'd be there as soon as he could. Emma had apparently accepted this with a practicality that Karen described on the phone as, frankly, a little unnerving for a 7-year-old, and had spent the 3 days making a card for the person in the accident, which she presented to Logan the moment he came through Karen's door, with the specific gravity of a child who has been working on something important. It was a hand-drawn card. On the front, a figure in what appeared to be a hospital bed, surrounded by flowers, and what Logan eventually identified as a dog. On the inside, in Emma's handwriting, which was improving but still had certain letters that went their own direction. "I hope you feel better soon. Ranger is a good dog, and I bet he helped." Logan stood in Karen's hallway and looked at the card for a moment longer than he needed to. "She insisted on the dog," Karen said from the kitchen doorway. "She's not wrong," Logan said. His voice came out slightly different than he intended, and he cleared his throat. "She's not wrong about the dog." Emma was watching him with the particular expression she wore when she was trying to read a situation that the adults around her weren't fully explaining. She was 7, but she'd been doing that expression since she was 4, and Logan had never figured out whether to be impressed or concerned by it. "Were you in danger?" she said. He crouched down to her level. Emma did not appreciate being managed, a trait she had possessed from approximately age 3, and the only approach that worked with her was directness calibrated for age appropriateness. "A little bit," he said, "but I'm okay. And I made sure you were safe first." She studied him. checked his face the way she did, looking for the tells she'd identified over years of living with him. The slight tension at the corner of his left eye when he was minimizing something, the two-level tone when he was managing information. Apparently she found nothing she considered disqualifying because she stepped forward and hugged him around the middle without ceremony, the way she always hugged, with her whole body and no reserve. He held on to her for a moment longer than usual. She let him. Amelia was discharged on the third day with a surgically set arm, a soft cast, a prescription for pain medication she would later describe as strong enough to be philosophically interesting, and a security detail of 2 federal agents who would remain assigned to her for the foreseeable future. She walked out of the hospital into overcast Oregon morning light, looked at the gray sky, and breathed in the outside air with the expression of someone who had been mentally preparing for this moment and found the reality of it slightly different from the preparation. Logan was there. He hadn't planned on being there. He'd been told by Torres that Amelia's discharge was coordinated through the Federal Protective Detail, that there was no need for him to be present. He'd driven there anyway. He wasn't entirely sure why, and he didn't examine it too carefully. She saw him across the parking lot and stopped walking. Then she kept walking, up to where he was standing with his hands in his pockets next to Curtis Webb's borrowed Chevy pickup, which he still needed to return. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." She looked at him for a moment. In the flat morning light, with the soft cast and the fading bruise along her hairline and the shadows under her eyes that 3 days of hospital sleep hadn't entirely erased, she looked like a person instead of a CEO, which was probably unfair because she'd been a person the entire time. He just hadn't always been able to see past the other thing. "The testimony," she said. "I gave a full deposition yesterday. Nora was there. Torres was there. 7 attorneys, 2 federal judges, and a stenographer." She paused. "It took 6 hours. How do you feel?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she brought to everything. "Like I've been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and I've set it down, but my body doesn't know that yet. My hands keep reaching for it." He understood that. More than he could easily explain, he understood exactly that. "Daniel Reeves," he said. "His family, do they know?" "I called his mother yesterday morning, before the deposition." Amelia's voice was steady, not because the subject didn't affect her, but because she'd found a way to hold it that allowed her to function. He recognized that management, too. She already suspected. She's been telling anyone who would listen for 8 months that her son didn't die the way they said. She stopped for a moment. She said thank you, and then she asked me if I knew whether Daniel had been scared at the end. Logan waited. I told her I didn't know, but that Daniel was one of the bravest people I'd ever worked with, that he knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. She met Logan's eyes. "I don't know if that was the right thing to say." "There isn't a right thing to say," Logan said. "There's just true and not true." That was true. She nodded once, looked at the truck. "Is that the same truck from Curtis Webb's property?" "I need to return it." "Are you going to tell him what happened?" "He'll have seen enough of the news to fill in the gaps." Logan looked at the truck. "I'm going to bring him a case of beer and not say much, and he's going to accept that, because that's the kind of man he is." Amelia looked at him with something that was almost a smile. Almost. "You have a very specific kind of person in your life." I picked carefully. The federal details vehicle pulled up then, smooth and unobtrusive, and one of the agents came around to open the door for Amelia with the efficient courtesy of people doing protective work correctly. She moved toward it, then stopped. "Logan," he looked at her. "The investigation is going to run for months. The trials, the federal proceedings, the civil cases that Voss Defense is going to have to navigate." She shook her head slightly. "My life for the next year or 2 is going to be a legal and institutional process that I don't entirely control. I'm not good at that." "You'll manage," he said, and meant it. "Probably." She looked at him steadily. "I'd like to stay in contact, if that's something you're open to." He thought about it. Honestly, for a real moment, because she deserved a real answer. "Yes," he said, "that's something I'm open to." She nodded. Something settled in her expression that had been slightly unsettled. Then she got in the federal vehicle, and it pulled away, and Logan stood in the hospital parking lot and watched it go. The drive to return Curtis's truck took 40 minutes. Curtis came out of the equipment shed when Logan pulled up, wiped his hands on a rag, looked the truck over for damage with the thoroughness of a man who trusted but verified, and found none. He accepted the case of beer Logan had bought at a gas station on the way. He looked at Logan's face and the state of Logan's coat, field-worn, dirty, the left sleeve torn at the shoulder from the ladder at the blind, and made no comment on any of it. "Dog okay?" Curtis said. "Dog's good." Ranger was in the back of Logan's own truck, parked beside the shed, watching the exchange with the alert calm of someone who'd completed a significant assignment and was ready to stand down. "Good dog," Curtis said, definitively, as though this was a conclusion he'd arrived at through analysis and was now committing to record. "The best I've ever worked with," Logan said, and meant that in every sense it could be meant. Curtis nodded, put the beer under his arm, looked at Logan for a moment with the particular direct gaze of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "You did right," Curtis said finally, "bringing them back here, using the high ground." He paused. "A lot of men would have run further, tried to get out of it entirely." "Running further wouldn't have ended it," Logan said. "No," Curtis agreed, "it wouldn't have." That was the whole conversation. Curtis went back into the shed. Logan drove home. His house was exactly as he'd left it, which was to say it was a mess. The chair he'd pulled to the couch still at the wrong angle, the coffee cups he hadn't washed before they left still in the sink, Emma's Dr. Seuss book still on the nightstand. The blue corduroy couch had a faint rust-colored stain on one cushion where Amelia's head wound had seeped through the gauze, and Logan looked at it for a moment before he went to the kitchen and got a cloth and some cold water and worked at it methodically until it was gone. He wasn't sure why removing the stain felt important. It just did. He picked Emma up from Karen's that evening. Emma had packed her own bag and included, for reasons that were her own, a rock collection, 3 library books, and the card she'd made for the person in the hospital, which Logan reminded her was already delivered. "I know," Emma said. "I made a second one. For Ranger." Logan looked at her. "For Ranger. He helped too." "He did," Logan agreed. The card for Ranger featured a drawing of a dog receiving what appeared to be a very large bone, surrounded by stars. Emma taped it to Ranger's water dish when they got home, and Ranger investigated it with his nose for approximately 4 seconds before lying down next to the dish in a way that Emma interpreted as approval and that Logan interpreted as Ranger being tired, which were not mutually exclusive. They had dinner. Nothing special. Eggs and toast because Logan hadn't gone to the grocery store, and the refrigerator was showing its truest self. Emma ate without complaint, which meant she was tired, and told him about the 3 days at Karen's with the slightly selective memory of a child who remembers the interesting parts and edits the rest. There had been a cat at Karen's that Ranger had coexisted with under a diplomatic framework Emma described as they both pretended the other one wasn't there. There had been a movie about a flying elephant that Emma had strong and nuanced feelings about. There had been a conversation with Karen's husband about what Logan did before he moved to Oregon, and Emma had explained it as he was in the Navy and he had a dog and they both helped people, which Logan, when she told him, thought was about as accurate a summary as anything he'd managed. After dinner, he read to her the Lorax as requested for what was probably the 5th time that month. Emma lay on her side on the couch, with her head on his arm and her feet tucked under the opposite cushion in the specific configuration that she held as optimal, and Logan read the words he'd read enough times that he could feel where the rhythm was going before he got there. And the house was warm, and Ranger was on the rug in front of them making the sound he made when he was fully relaxed, a low periodic exhale that functioned as a kind of ambient reassurance. Emma was asleep before the end. He finished the book anyway. Not for her, just because it felt right to finish it. He sat for a while after, in the quiet house, with his daughter's weight against his arm and the dog on the floor, and the particular quality of stillness that was different from the silence of the last 2 days in ways that didn't require articulating. He thought about Adrian Mercer, not with anger, that had burned off somewhere in the timber above Curtis's cabin, standing over the man in the dark. What remained was more complicated. 7 years of genuine mentorship, real knowledge, real investment in Logan's development as a soldier and as a person. And underneath all of it, running parallel the entire time, a careful and methodical corruption that Mercer had apparently compartmentalized with the same discipline he brought to everything else. Logan didn't know how a person built those two things simultaneously inside themselves. He suspected Mercer had found a way to believe they were separate, that the mentor and the criminal occupied different rooms and the door between them stayed closed. The door never stayed closed. That was the thing Mercer had never understood, or had understood and refused to acknowledge. Eventually, everything in a person connected to everything else. The way you treated the people under your command connected to the way you treated the truth. The values you taught connected to the values you practiced. You couldn't build honor in other people while dismantling it in yourself and expect the architecture to hold. Logan had needed to see Mercer's story reach its end to understand something he'd always known intellectually but not felt completely. That the things worth doing were worth doing because of what they were, not because of what they returned. He'd pulled Amelia Voss from a burning car because a person was dying, and he was there, and he could. Not because he'd weighed the consequences, not because it fit into a plan, because she needed help, and he had it, and that was sufficient reason. Everything that followed had been complicated and costly, and had taken things from him and required things from him that he hadn't been sure he still had. But the seed of it had been simple. A dog stopped on a fog-covered cliff. A man followed the dog's instincts. A woman was alive who would otherwise be dead. Simple things didn't stay simple, but they were still where everything started. Months passed the way months did, not cleanly, not in a straight line, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days punctuated by things that mattered. The federal investigation expanded exactly as Holt had suggested it would. Mercer faced a federal indictment that ran to 43 counts: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and accessory charges related to Daniel Reeves's death, which the reopened investigation reclassified as a homicide within 6 weeks of intake. His consulting firm was dissolved by court order. The network he'd built over 6 years unwound in public, name by name, institution by institution, in a process that was slow and grinding and not at all cinematic, but that was, in the assessment of people who understood how these things worked, unusually thorough. Mercer pled not guilty. His trial was scheduled for 14 months out. Logan received a subpoena for testimony and responded to it through an attorney Nora Vance recommended. He wasn't particularly worried about the testimony. He knew what he'd done and why he'd done it, and he could account for every decision in the sequence from the cliff to the timber. That kind of accounting was something he was practiced at. Ray Dalton received a formal acknowledgement from 3 different federal agencies for his role in the investigation. Acknowledgements he described to Logan over the phone as about as useful as a thank you card from a dentist, but that Logan suspected meant more to him than he was willing to admit. Nora Vance was appointed to a senior position in the DOJ's Organized Crime Division 6 months after the filing. She sent Logan a text message when it was announced that said only 40 pages. Worth it. He texted back, "Copy that." That was the entirety of their correspondence, which felt exactly right. Curtis Webb received a replacement for the propane camp heaters Logan had used at the Deer Blind. A newer model, better output, delivered to his equipment shed by a driver who also left a handwritten note that said, "For the Deer Blind, thank you for the high ground." Curtis, when he called Logan about it, was characteristically brief. "Didn't need new heaters," he said. "They're better than the old ones," Logan said. "I know," Curtis said. "That's what I'm saying," and hung up. Amelia rebuilt Voss defense systems from the inside out. It was not a fast process, and it was not a comfortable one. 3 board members resigned in the first month when it became clear the restructuring was real and not cosmetic, and 2 major government contracts went into review pending the outcome of the federal investigation. And there were 3 separate months where the company's financial position was genuinely uncertain. She navigated all of it with the focused pragmatism that was her fundamental nature, the thing that had existed underneath the CEO exterior the whole time, and that Logan now understood was just who she was, stripped of any performance. She called Logan from her office 7 months after the hospital. It was a Wednesday, late afternoon, and he was in the backyard watching Emma attempt to teach Ranger a trick that Ranger was performing the physical motions of while radiating palpable condescension. "The K9 program," Amelia said without preamble. "I've been working on it for 3 months. Search and rescue, funded through the Voss Foundation, partnered with 3 state emergency management agencies. Equipment, training, handler support." A pause. "I want to name it." "Name what?" Logan said, watching Ranger very deliberately look away from Emma's treat while sitting precisely where she'd asked him to sit, in a way that communicated volumes. "The program. I want to name it after Ranger." Logan was quiet for a moment. Emma had successfully gotten Ranger to perform the behavior she wanted and was now celebrating with a level of enthusiasm that Ranger was tolerating with the stoic patience of a professional. "He'd find that embarrassing," Logan said. "He's a dog. He's a very particular dog." Logan. He could hear the specific quality of her voice when she was about to be direct about something she cared about. He'd come to recognize it. "Let me do this. It matters." He looked at Ranger, who had turned back to Emma and was accepting the treat with the dignified restraint of someone receiving an honor they had not sought but would not refuse. "Yeah," Logan said. "Okay." The program launched 8 months after the investigation began, with a ceremony in Portland that Logan attended and that Emma attended and that Ranger attended in the official capacity of program namesake, which Emma explained to every person who would listen with an authority that suggested she had been waiting her entire life to be the keeper of important canine information. Amelia spoke at the ceremony with the precision and absence of sentimentality that characterized her public speaking, but at the end she said something that wasn't in the prepared remarks. Something short, added in the pause before the closing, in a quieter register. She said, "The greatest strength I found through all of this was not in institutions or systems or money. It was in people who showed up when there was nothing in it for them. I would like every person who works with this program to carry that forward. Show up. Especially when there's no obvious return." Logan stood in the back of the room with Emma beside him, and Ranger at his left knee, and listened to that and didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. On a Saturday morning, 10 months after the fog-covered cliff, Logan ran the coastal trail again for the first time since that morning. He'd avoided it. Not consciously, not with any deliberate decision. He'd just found other routes, other mornings, other rhythms, and the cliff trail had stayed unrun in the rotation without him examining why. But this particular morning, he woke before dawn and looked at the ceiling and decided that avoiding things was a habit he could afford less than he'd thought. Ranger ran ahead, the way he always had. 8 years old and moving through the early morning fog with the same authority he'd always moved with, nose working, ears rotating, completely absorbed in the information the world was offering him. The trail was the same. The fog was the same thick gray that swallowed the coast and softened all the edges. The sound of the water below was the same, constant and indifferent, and strangely comforting in the way that large, permanent things sometimes were. He reached the section of guardrail, the place where Ranger had stopped 10 months ago, on a morning Logan had believed was going to be ordinary. He stopped there now, looked out at the fog over the water, thought about the sequence of things that had followed that stop, the pull of a car door, the weight of a woman in his arms, the explosion at his back. He thought about who he'd been on that morning, a man running a trail before dawn to claim one quiet hour, a man who had been trying very deliberately to build walls between what he'd been and what he wanted to be next. He'd believed those walls were necessary. He'd built them carefully. What the last 10 months had taught him, at a cost he was still reckoning, was that the walls were always partial. You couldn't fully separate the person you'd been from the person you were, not because the past owned you, but because you were made of it. And the skills and the instincts and the particular way of seeing situations that his years in service had built were not things that lived on the other side of a wall. They were in him. They were him. The question was what you did with them. He looked out at the fog and thought about Daniel Reeves, who had been 31 and careful and scared and had pulled the thread anyway. He thought about Curtis Webb, who had looked at a stranger in trouble and offered his property and his silence without negotiating terms. He thought about Karen Holt, who had gotten out of bed past midnight and driven across town because a man she trusted had asked her to. No questions, just okay. He thought about Ray. burning his own exposure to help someone he hadn't spoken to in 18 months. He thought about Nora, filing 40 pages under her own name into a proceeding controlled by the people she was challenging. None of them had been in a position where the right thing was cost-free. All of them had paid something, and all of them had done it anyway, in the specific quiet way that people did things that mattered, without announcement, without certainty about the outcome, without any guarantee that it would be worth what it cost. That was the only thing that actually worked. Logan had known it for a long time in the way that you knew things before you understood them. He understood it now. The fog was beginning to lift at the horizon, a thin line of silver where the water met the sky, widening slowly as the sun came up somewhere behind the overcast. Ranger had come back to stand beside him, which was unusual. The dog usually pushed ahead on the trail, setting the pace, monitoring the path. But he'd come back and was standing shoulder to hip with Logan, looking out at the water the way Logan was looking at it. Logan put his hand on the dog's back, between the shoulders. He thought about Emma, asleep at the house, who would wake up in about an hour and want pancakes, and would have strong opinions about the pancake-to-syrup ratio, and would negotiate her screen time with the tactical sophistication of someone who'd been studying the subject since infancy, who would at some point today, as she did most days, do something that stopped Logan's chest for a moment, with the particular combination of ordinary and extraordinary that was specific to watching a small person be themselves. He thought about all of it, and what it added up to, and found that what it added up to was not what he'd expected when he'd first moved to this coast to build a quiet life. He'd expected quiet. He'd gotten something messier and more costly and less clean. But he'd also gotten something he hadn't known he was missing, the understanding that the life he'd been trying to protect by containing himself was actually larger than the container, that the same instinct that made him follow Ranger to the edge of a cliff on a fog-covered morning was the same instinct that made him read the Lorax 4 times in a month and argue about bedtime with the 7-year-old who cited legal precedent. It was all the same thing. It was all him. He was not a former SEAL. He was not a single father. He was not someone who had once mattered and was now trying to find a smaller version of mattering to be satisfied with. He was a man who showed up. That was the whole of it. That was enough. Ranger looked up at him, waiting. "Yeah," Logan said. "Let's go." They ran together into the lifting fog, man and dog, the trail opening ahead of them in the growing light, and behind them the ocean kept moving the way it always had and always would, constant, indifferent, vast, and entirely unconcerned with the small human story that had just quietly, imperfectly, found its way to something like an ending. Not a clean ending, not a perfect one, but a true one. And in the long run, that was the only kind that held.